And now we are delighted to kick off the conference with Michelle Adelman, who is a Cornellian, by the way. She has a fascinating story in which she really did take a crazy, I'll say crazy, Michelle, career detour, which I'm really excited to hear more about. Scott Belsky, as many of you know Scott, he's been with us at this conference for the last 8 years, believe it or not. He'll be the MC for this discussion. And I will literally be popping onto the screen once in a while to ask an audience question. So we will not save the audience questions for the end. We'll just do them throughout each presentation. So Scott and Michelle, have at it. I'm going to pop off.
Thank you, Zach. And hi, Michelle. How are you?
Hey, how are you doing, Scott?
Pretty good. Well, Zach, thanks to you and the crew for keeping this conference going despite the conditions. I think it's just a great annual pilgrimage, if you will, for entrepreneurs, within and beyond the Cornell extended family. And I just love that, that we make this happen and keep it going. And Michelle, thanks for joining us. I'm excited to interview you this morning. So maybe we should just start with a simple question. So where are you physically at the moment?
Yeah, so, you think it's a simple question, but it never really is. So I'm currently in Dhaka, Bangladesh. What you see behind me, I'm going to give you guys a little virtual background tour here as we go through this morning. But, this is social distancing Bangladeshi style. So my partner is the U.S. ambassador to Bangladesh, which we met just about a little over 6 years ago at a farmer's market in Botswana. So it's one of those a little bit of a made for TV movie stories. But I've spent so much of the last 10 years focused in Africa, and it's really fascinating to be able to live in Bangladesh part-time and to be in Asia and to really be able to compare and contrast what happens in Africa and what happens in South Asia, because there's so many similarities and yet really a lot of fundamental differences that we can learn from.
Wow. And what time is it there right now?
It's 10:15 p.m. So,
okay,
I'm well past happy hour.
Thank you for staying up late. Feel free to have a glass of wine or whatever while we're talking. So I understand that you graduated from Cornell in 1989, and then you went into management consulting. You spent 20 years at Accenture. And I mean, let's face it, you were a global managing director of one of the best consulting firms in the world. And then you moved on. Maybe you could give us a sense of what made you take the leap.
Well, look, I had an amazing career at Accenture, and I didn't know what I wanted to do when I graduated, and Accenture gave me an amazing place to work in different industries and with different clients. And there's no place that I would have rather spent those kind of formative years of my career. And it taught me a huge amount of professional discipline and focus on basics of people, process, and technology. And I don't think I would have been as successful as an entrepreneur without having that grounding. But I had a little bit of a non-traditional career within Accenture. I was a brand new partner in 2000 when the market crashed. And so literally, you're supposed to be out there trying to sell business and close deals, and nothing was going on. So I got involved with an internal strategy project, which was just post the IPO around how to create new business lines within Accenture. And so I had the privilege and the opportunity to kind of get off the traditional client partner career track and really work on, launching new businesses, turning around businesses that had been acquired. And I had a chance to kind of break a lot of rules within this kind of very staid environment. And I learned that I actually was pretty good at it. I was pretty good at breaking rules. And I think it's attributed to the Dalai Lama, but I'm sure that he didn't say, you need to learn the rules. So it helped start one of our business process outsourcing businesses. And I ended up running a big market making portfolio. But Accenture got very big, and I really wanted to have a hand at having a more direct hand at running businesses. So I was recruited away to run a new healthcare startup. So it was a clean sheet of paper. And so I jumped at the opportunity. And it was only 2 years later, after I had successfully launched this new company, that I made my big leap and moved to Africa.
Got it. Now, I think I remember reading an article where it said that you had an epiphany. You were buying a sports car, and suddenly this epiphany caused you to, I don't know if you ended up buying the sports car, but you sold your New York City apartment and you moved to Botswana. Can you give a little context for us?
Yeah, my mother hates the story, by the way, because it makes me, it makes it sound like I had this massive midlife crisis instead of, doing something that was, truly purposeful. So I had been working and doing nonprofit work in Africa for a number of years prior to this all happening. And I was doing a lot of work with orphan and vulnerable children. And, in Africa, particularly in the southern part of Africa, the HIV/AIDS crisis really wreaked havoc on kind of the family system. And, in Botswana, for example, which is behind me, it's a little country of 2 million people. There are nearly 200,000 orphans who have lost one or both of their parents during the HIV/AIDS crisis. And so I was doing a lot of work doing advocacy for early childhood education, trying to create safe places for kids to be after school, and trying to find ways of engaging the mothers and the caregivers in the children's future. And the challenge that we kept on coming across through the foundation and work that I was doing is that the youth unemployment rate is incredibly high and economic diversification is really low. The economy is basically based on diamonds and a little bit of tourism, and that's it. So, and the youth unemployment rate is nearly 40%, not 4 or 14, but 40. And so, 50% of the pregnancies are girls under 18 years old. So it's the children having the children. And you could do all of this work you wanted with young people. But if the child went back to an environment of poverty, you weren't really making any difference. And I started to get very frustrated. And I decided that actually the best way that I could make a difference through my nonprofit work was to actually go build businesses that would create employment, especially for women. And so, I was standing in the car parking lot looking at what was really a gorgeous navy blue Porsche convertible. And I was trying to decide, it was my reward having, launched this new healthcare company. And I said to myself, I can buy this car, or I can take this money and I can deploy it into a venture fund and I can start building businesses in Africa and, put my money where my mouth is. And so, that's what I did. And, it's interesting because I talked to a lot of young people and a lot of, Cornellians, especially those who are working in global development, and they're all like, oh, what you do is so amazing. I want to do that. And I have to say, I'm really glad that I did it when I did it, because having a little money in the bank is definitely helpful. And, we all know that money doesn't buy happiness, but it's awfully useful, especially if you're going to do something crazy like, pack up all your worldly belongings and move to Africa.
So what a story, and very inspiring. So, okay, so now you find yourself as an entrepreneur and an entrepreneur enabler with a real focus on technology-led food solutions, I think broadly defined in Africa. And I'm just trying to get my head around this. So in 2017, you were named CEO Global as Africa's most influential woman, I believe, in business and professional services. And in 2019, you were named the Forbes Africa 20 New Wealth Creators list, which is a really cool distinction, clearly like opening up the aperture for entrepreneurs and possibility. Maybe you can share why you started your current company, and explain its core businesses.
Yeah. And Zach, was there a question you wanted me?
Sorry,
before you go there. So the question is why did you pick Africa as opposed to some other country or continent? I mean, there's plenty of places that need help. I mean, so why Africa?
There's plenty of places that need help. It's like what's in front of you, right? So, I mean, I think part of it was I was really involved already on the ground, doing nonprofit work. So, I felt a sense of connection. But, part of it is when you're in Africa, I find, and I think it maybe is the same is true in Asia, but certainly in Africa, you look at the problems that are around and you're like, wait a minute, like we know how to do this, right? Like we know how to solve these problems. We're from the future, right? We know how to use greenhouses to grow fresh produce. And, we know about, there's these things called solar panels. And so for me, the problems were very vast and the solution seemed very apparent. And it just seemed like there was a really big opportunity. And at the end of the day, it was really tied, and everything that I do is really tied very much to a mission. Meaning that I always have some sort of strategic intent when I try to start a business and really look at that from the long run. And so especially, again, tying this back to the employment of women, to be able to drive support for them, money for them, and then to have that feedback to children in education programs really was at the core of it. But let me just tell you a little bit about then how I formed Accite. So I founded and run a small boutique firm called Accite, and we focus entirely on food and ag tech in Sub-Saharan Africa, focused on building companies that will spur economic diversification, employment of women, and really enabling the continent to be more food secure. So what we do is we look for proven technologies that have been developed primarily in Western markets, but sometimes in emerging markets, and put them together with world-class teams to really build these kind of new pioneering businesses. So I always have about 3 businesses going on at once, because one of the things about Africa is that things move at their own pace. So if you don't have like 3 things going on at once, nothing's really happening. So we have Go Fresh, which is a hydroponic fresh produce business where we built very high-tech hydroponic greenhouses in the desert, in Botswana, in a country that imported 80% of its fresh fruits and vegetables, and that is only 2% of the land is arable. And so we use this, very well-known, proven technology used across the US and Israel and Holland, and we implemented it in the African context. The second business that we have is, and Go Fresh, the mission is to change the supply chain of how fresh produce is grown. So in Africa, about 60% of fresh produce is lost somewhere in the supply chain. It's either wasted or it's actually lost at the farm before it even gets to the consumer.
Do you know how that compares to more to like United States? I mean, I'm just curious.
Yeah, it's lower, right? So what we have is we have a lot bigger farm waste, and we have farm waste because you've got farm waste, you've got supply chain waste,
right?
You've got food waste on the plate, the stuff that gets thrown, and then you got stuff that they steal, and all that other stuff. We have a lot more, so it's much higher in Africa than it would be in the US. So, we built these greenhouses 25 kilometers from the consumer, and we took all the carbon out of the supply chain. So we pick fresh daily and we deliver to the customers. We have very little transportation carbon. We have very little spoilage because we basically pick fresh to order and deliver it. So it was a way of taking this technology, implementing it in a context of how Africa works, and then and making that impact. And today we employ about 75 people. 80% of them are women and are head of household. And the money that they earn is what feeds them and their kids and their sisters' kids and so on and so on. So our second business is Infinite Foods. So Infinite Foods is creating an ecosystem for plant-based foods to take hold in Africa. So we're all about the Beyond Burger and the Impossible Burger, and plant-based food is all crazy in the US. But if you look at 2050 and the food security problems, the food security problems and the growth of the protein market in particular from animal-based meat and dairy, it's not coming from the US, right? Yeah, we're 325 million people and we're big per capita consumers of protein. We're not really growing either consumption or population. But Africa is growing 2.5 times faster than the rest of the world. Protein consumption is increasing at 4% per annum. And effectively, most farming today in Africa is smallholder and relatively regenerative, but it's on a collision course with industrialized farming. And if we don't change how people eat and how they think about their food choices and the impact on the environment, Africa will go the way of the West. And so we have this opportunity to help the continent effectively leapfrog to a healthy and sustainable food system. And so Infinite Foods is introducing, international brands like Beyond Meat and Oatly and Miyoko's into the African market. We are developing local brands and supporting young entrepreneurs to develop their brands. And we're doing a lot of consumer education to help address this issue. And then we have I have a new company that's incubating, which is kind of, it's like a baby that I didn't plan on having, but it's a blended protein solution. So it's called Crossover Meats. And it's a way of saying, look, as much as I believe in plant-based food, and I believe plant-based food is going to be a major part of our future, changing everybody's behavior is going to take a long time. So can we not find ways of making more environmentally friendly meat with the tools that we have and give people real meat solutions? And so Crossover Meats blends protein, primarily chicken, with other meats to be able to create hamburger basically out of chicken.
Interesting. And then, so obviously common themes across all three businesses. Do you find that the governments are the wind at your backs, or are they getting in the way, or are they sort of, do they not, and sort of indifferent? What's the role of the government for entrepreneurs like yourself in Africa?
Yeah, so the approach that I've taken with government, and government moves very slowly, and they tend to be fairly corrupt. And so the approach that I've taken is we always keep government informed, right? So I do a lot of briefing with the ministers and with the Office of the President and with the various stakeholders. And we like to keep them informed of what we're doing so they know what we're doing, but we never ask for anything. Because the minute you start asking for things is when, they start expecting briefcases full of cash to start rocking up on their doorstep. So for me, that's one of my tricks, right? Which is we keep the government briefed, but we don't ask for anything. The second thing is to really try to drive back to what their strategic agenda is. And dealing with African governments isn't different than dealing with any other stakeholder you might deal with in business, which is, what is their agenda? What are they trying to accomplish? And then how can you take and craft your story of what you're doing to achieve that mission? And in the case of Botswana, it's about domestic food security, it's about employment creation. And so the government is very supportive of what we do and pretty much stays out of our way and lets us do our thing, but they're not exactly, giving us free resources to accomplish what we need to accomplish.
So you kind of have to.
It's very careful. It's a very delicate dance.
Right. I can imagine. It's, you have to kind of make the government look good, but you can't ask for anything in the process of doing so, it sounds like.
Hey, Michelle, can you give an example or two of how that government interaction has played out?
Yeah. So, I'll talk to a little bit about it. So for example, one of the things we've been really pushing with government in Botswana to do is to actually build more greenhouses, right? Because if you look at the ROI on a commercial greenhouse business, the space that you can play in the market is very small, right? You really can only play at the top end of the market and the parts of the market that are, more tourism, food service, and the higher end, upper middle class part of the market. And after that, it falls off really fast and you're really into commodity crops that it's very difficult to make money on. But, there are strategic reasons why governments would want to have more greenhouses, right? And domestic food security is a big one. And employment creation is another big one. And so we've been actively collaborating with government to help them set policies that would enable them to build the infrastructure that's very difficult for a commercial grower like myself to get the ROI on, that we can then operate. So we get them, we get what we want, which is a bunch of greenhouses, and they get what they want, which is food security and employment creation. So that's an example of how you need to really play into what the government's agenda is and find this kind of win-win to create a public-private partnership.
It's interesting. It just seems like I mean, you've been doing it for a while now, so you're used to it. But for most of us, like the thought of jumping into that completely foreign environment, which is, relatively non-uniform from country to country, right, in Africa, and you really seem to deal with it quite well. I just think it's fascinating.
Well, Africa is a very complex place to do business. So sometimes I try to make the analogy, they're effectively, if you just look at Sub-Saharan Africa, so let's not deal with North Africa, which has got its own set of stuff, right? If you just deal with Sub-Saharan Africa, there are 54 countries, all of which have their own currency. There's 2,000 languages. Everybody has their own borders, cultural norms, social norms, politics, politicians. So, imagine if, every time you wanted to drive from New York to DC, I mean, I lose track of my US geography now, but like how many state borders do you cross, right? You go from New York to New Jersey to Pennsylvania to Delaware to Virginia, right? So you cross 5 state borders just getting from New York to DC. Imagine if every time you hit a state border, you had to stop, get out of your car, maybe pay a bribe, change currency, wait in queue, fill out forms, before you can move on to the next state. So, so it's a very complex place to do business. And so one of the challenges of working in Africa is that there's not one Africa. There are 54 Africas. And within that 54 Africas, there's probably only 10 that move the needle. For example, the 7 countries that surround South Africa that are part of what they call the SADC Union. I mean, all of those countries combined, the South African economy is 7 times as big as all of those countries combined. So you have to really figure out where you're going to focus to drive results, because Africa is not a thing. It's a lot of things. So for example, with Infinite Foods, we're very focused on creating 3 big regional hubs. So we're working in South Africa as the hub for the southern part of Africa, in Kenya as a hub for East Africa, in Ghana as a hub for West Africa. And culturally, and just everything is, if you go, the difference between Southern, Western, and Eastern Africa is enormous, just unto itself.
It sounds daunting in some ways, the way you're describing it, but I am curious. I mean, you've obviously seen business in the US, and now you've seen business deeply in Africa. Is there anything that is easier, or are there any interesting, unique advantages, benefits, bonuses of building in Africa these days?
Well, I mean, it's easier if you're a problem junkie. Because there's a lot of problems to solve.
Never a dull moment.
There's never a dull moment, and the problems just present themselves to you on a regular basis. There is, as a foreigner, and what's very interesting, as a white American woman, I get a tremendous amount of access because people are very confused what the heck I'm doing there. And I use it to my advantage, right? So I don't fit into anybody's stereotypical box. I'm not Dutch or English, so I'm not an evil colonialist. I'm not a man, but I seem to have some money, so that's all very confusing. And I went to Africa completely on my own. And so, here I was, running around doing my thing, and people were genuinely confused. And I just used it to my advantage because they wanted to know what the heck this person was doing and what this was all about. You are kind of always a foreigner, though. I mean, and I think one of the things that I've really prided myself on in how I've built and conducted my business is to really make sure you understand the social context and I know that I'm a guest on this continent, right? And I never think of myself otherwise. And, a lot of what I focus on is trying to build that next generation of leaders, hiring young people, whether it be, right out of college or out of the village, and providing a platform for them to build their skills, and to have a better life.
Great. Hey, Scott, I have a couple other questions that came in. Can I tackle
Sure,
those?
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Zach.
So Michelle, this one says, very inspiring. Thank you. What keeps you going despite all the barriers, and what keeps you up at night?
So what keeps me going is the impact that you can see that you can make. And I think this is one of the things that I just really, in many ways, treasure about what I do in Africa, which is you can see the impact that you make on people's lives. And you can see change. I mean, we created in 4 years, kind of the biggest brand in fresh produce in a country, right? So, you can see that, when we launched Infinite Foods in South Africa with the Beyond Burger, everybody thought we were crazy. What's the old saying, first they laugh at you and then they ignore you, then they fight you and then you win, right? So, I mean, they thought I was nuts. They're like, who's going to buy the Beyond Burger in South Africa? And the Beyond guys thought I was nuts, right? And, but a year and a half later, I'm one of their biggest international distributors. So, we got it on the map. And so you can really feel that tangible change that you can make. I mean, what keeps me up at night is it's a really, what gets me excited is making that change, right? It's creating that fundamental change. And the problems are so complex. In some ways, you're just, no matter how hard you try, no matter how big you get, you're just going to be a drop in the bucket. For me, we set the mission of our business, what we want to try to accomplish. We keep really focused on accomplishing that mission, and then we're satisfied. And so those missions and those visions are very big, very pioneering, very aspirational. Will we ever get there? No. We have to take pleasure in the change that we can make in individual people's lives. And one of the things that I figured out a long time ago was, I wasn't gonna, I'm not Mother Teresa to begin with, but, you weren't gonna really change everybody's lives, right? But if I can help one young entrepreneur, one female entrepreneur be inspired to have skills. I mean, my personal assistant, she rocked up for a job that required, skills that were well above what she had. She was a college graduate that was a cashier at a fast food place. That was the only job she could get. And, she started as a personal assistant, and then she started doing research, and then she started doing project management. And now she runs the whole Go Fresh business office. I'm in Bangladesh, and she's running the whole thing. And now she's going to go on and start her own confectionery business, and I'm supporting that and investing in that and helping making her successful. And I have to just be satisfied that maybe I only impacted that one person's life in a fundamental way, and that's okay, and that's good.
I was going to ask you about the bench strength of leadership of these businesses, and whether the emerging leaders are folks that you've brought over from the US, or are they are they locals who are working and rising the ranks?
Yeah, it depends on the team. I mean, our Go Fresh team is very, very local. And we spend a lot of time, and I've actually had a ton of Cornell Cal's global fellows who come spend the summer with us, and we've really trained them from scratch. Our Infinite Foods team is a little bit more blended of getting experts, local, international experts, and locals. I think one of the important things is creating a safe place for people to fail. And look, I've failed a ton, and nobody advertises their failures. Right? Nobody goes, oh, wow, that business that I bought, I got, that was really a mess, right? My business partner tried to screw me and the books were cooked and it was a complete disaster and I didn't understand the unit economics. It was a complete flop. I mean, people don't run around and say that stuff, but that's where you learn, right? That learning moment is when you're laying on the floor, and the bigger the fail, the bigger the learning experience, for me. So it's that moment that you have to pick yourself up and brush yourself off and understand, the strength of your relationships and the strengths of yourself. And so I try as much as I can to create that environment for these young people, because, who else is going to give them that opportunity to fail and pick themselves up and learn? And that's the only rule, right? They can break as many things as they want, but they have to pick themselves up and carry on.
Scott, so I'm going to ask
Love
one more audience question, and then we'll have probably time for maybe one other question from Scott before we have to sign off. I know the time flies by. So here's a nice one. It's well put. It says, Michelle, you are my hero. Can you talk a little about existential threats such as global warming and antibiotic-resistant bacteria, to the extent that these might have been factored into your strategic planning? And somebody asked a related question, whether you thought GMOs would be useful for what you're doing in Africa. So those questions kind of relate with the antibiotic-resistant bacteria things. Any thoughts on how science or existential threats might be impacting you?
Well, existential threats are definitely impacting us. So, Cape Town was one of the first major international cities that literally was 2 days away from completely running out of water. Behind me is the farm in Mound. We're having the hottest, our summer, we're moving into summer season because we're backwards, but we've just had the hottest October that we can remember on record. The river that runs in front of our farm completely dried up last year. That's coming from the Okabanga Delta. It's a good chance it's going to dry up again this year. So we are definitely seeing the impacts of global warming, in particular, on our continent. And frankly, that's why we're so focused on using technologies like hydroponics that protect water resources and looking at plant-based food that can keep us away from having to move down those industrialized agriculture environments where, you've got to chock the animals full of antibiotics and fun stuff. GMOs are a totally more complex topic, very different across each of those 54 countries in terms of their attitudes towards GMOs and their level of acceptance of GMOs. You've seen South Africa, for example, has been very successful in allowing and introducing GMO crops, but it's hard because it's government by government by government. You have to go and get approval, so it's a lot of heavy lifting, as Dr. Sarah Wenger knows. So yeah,
great.
There's lots of existential threats.
And Scott, do you want to cap it off with our last final question?
Last final question that I do love asking people with careers like yourself is just, as you look back, anything you would have done differently, any memory you have where you're like, should have made a move on that more quickly, or should have made a different decision. We're always curious to hear, if you don't mind sharing.
I think I don't know if I'm weird or not, but I don't really ever look back. It's just not in my DNA. I think that it's always good to reflect on what's happened in the past and to understand what you've learned and how you can take that forward. But I just choose not to really live with regrets. And as I said, for all of the times that I've failed, that's made me a stronger person. It's made me a more empathetic person. It's very interesting to have gone through this election cycle. My view on politics and on what's right and what's wrong and what's important, what's not important has completely changed because of the work that I've done and the experiences that I've had. And so for that, I'll, be forever grateful that I didn't buy that gorgeous Porsche and instead, built greenhouses in Botswana.
Excellent.
Well, maybe that's our takeaway is when you're at the moment where you're about to buy that Porsche, No. Anyways,
There you
thank you
go.
so much, Michelle. Really appreciate you joining us tonight.
You're
Your
very
time.
welcome.
Thanks,
Thank you
Michelle.
so much for having me.
Yep.
All right.
See you
Bye.
soon.